On the day when Beslan started burying its dead, traffic on the route to the cemetery was backed up by so many cars carrying coffins. Everyone in the small Caucasus town had either lost a relative or knew someone who had perished during School Number 1 siege. Terrorists with heavy weapons, mostly from Chechnya, launched the three-day terror attack. A total of 334 individuals perished, with 186 of them being minors. Today marks 20 years since the siege's abrupt end in catastrophic explosions. However, I can still hear the mothers of Beslan weeping, the sorrow that washed the town in waves. I can see 11-year-old Alina's white, open casket being delicately set out in her front yard with her dolls nestled next to her. And I will never forget Rima, who was held captive for 3 days in the stuffy school gym along with hundreds of other people, with bombs hanging from the basketball hoops above them. She had admitted back then that she felt embarrassed about having lived. She had to scramble over a tiny boy's lifeless body as she and her grandchildren fled under fire. Rima cried uncontrollably and pleaded with God to pardon them. In 2004, Beslan's misery reverberated throughout Russia and the rest of the world. The disaster was mostly the result of the dozens of men and women storming the school, firing into the air, and kidnapping hundreds of terrified people. They'd rounded up small girls with large white bows in their hair and mothers with babies and balloons. Entire families who had been rejoicing over the first day of classes. After packing the gym with explosives, the militants started to execute the male hostages. That summer, the boundaries of the southern Russian Republic had already been breached by Vladimir Putin's ruthless campaign against separatists in Chechnya, which had been started 4 years earlier. 10 people lost their lives when a Chechen woman detonated herself at a Moscow metro station the day before the Beslan siege. Prior to that, a music event was attacked fatally and 2 planes were destroyed by suicide bombers. However, in their resolve to not give in to terrorists, Mr. Putin and his authorities handled the Beslan assault in a way that has raised serious, lingering problems for the past 20 years. Did they attempt to bargain at all? When the attackers demanded that Russian troops leave Chechnya, why do they say they made no political demands? Is it possible that additional kids were released? Above all, why, while hundreds of hostages were still inside the school, did rescuers deploy flamethrowers and fire from tanks? Many saw the Beslan siege as a chance to learn important early lessons about Putinism, namely that he would stop at nothing and by anyone to subdue anyone who dared to question him. 20 years passed before Mr. Putin paid a visit to the wreckage of School Number 1. He didn't attend the anniversary celebrations with the families even then. He was the only one that went there 2 weeks ago. A couple of the school's broken walls held. It would be inconceivable for the majority of world leaders to have never been here before. The most deadly terror attack to ever strike Russia. However, Mr. Putin has always insisted on being photographed with soldiers at his side or on a fighter plane. His action man persona is unaffected by the children's graves that he was unable to save. He had actually been to Beslan previously, though he had hardly realized it. He had flown in late at night to see a hospital under cover of darkness shortly after the siege ended. By dawn, he was gone, but he had convinced Beslan that all of Russia was in grief with them. I recall hearing then from bereaved relatives, he came far too late. He ought to have stayed here with us. However, President Putin was too timid. His past experience with grieving women 4 years prior had left him afraid and wounded. It took him 5 days to cancel his vacation when the Kursk submarine sank in 2000, and by the time he sought his relatives, they had ripped him to pieces. Thus, Mr. Putin started to establish the meticulously planned gathering as a defining feature of his leadership. Only tiny, carefully screened groups. Everything is in order. Only 3 mothers were brought to meet him in Beslan last month. For the benefit of the state TV camera, Mr. Putin told them it was an awful act of terror that took the lives of 334 people. Of that number, 136 were children. Although the mothers aren't visible at that time, they undoubtedly cringed at his error. Because Beslan claimed the lives of 186 children. Everyone in the community has that number ingrained in their memory. It's the one item you always remember. However, Mr. Putin did not go to Beslan to show sympathy. The black-clad moms served only as props. He was making a point with them. He reminded the Russians that he had fought and prevailed in his war on terror 20 years prior. He pledged he would win the struggle against the hostile West and neo-Nazis he was now facing in Ukraine. Lies and distortion were already part of Putin's 2004 game. Then, the number of captives in Beslan was drastically underreported by officials. On the first day of the siege, I arrived in town and quickly discovered that there were 3 times as many hostages in that school than the officials were acknowledging. Everyone in the area told us as much. However, state TV reporters carried on with the falsehood as directed. The officials were downplaying the number of casualties because people thought the troops were getting ready to storm the school. I've frequently pondered what would happen to a Western democracy's government in the event of an attack in which the number of hostages killed exceeded the number of terrorists. It would probably have trouble surviving the upcoming election and the expected official investigation. Nor did Vladimir Putin have any concerns. The European Court of Human Rights declared in 2017 that Russia had used indiscriminate force as the siege broke and had not fulfilled its obligation to safeguard the captives. Mothers who had lost their children and were longing for justice filed the lawsuit. However, Russia itself did not conduct any additional investigations. Senior authorities not held responsible. Putin expressed surprise and pledged to investigate the 3 Beslan mothers' complaints at their August meeting. He has 20 years. But immediately following the siege, he did address one issue, claiming that doing away with direct elections for governors in Russia's regions will enhance security. Mr. Putin made the announcement in 2004. There was absolutely no relation to the Beslan incident. Opposition lawmakers demonstrated against a slipping dictatorship outside the building as Parliament convened to decide whether to approve the move. After 20 years, there is no longer any resistance. The state media is completely subdued. Democracy has been destroyed. The main lesson that Mr. Putin learned from the Beslan siege was to exert more authority.